In the early hours of May 4th, 2017, a car burned in a remote area near Foix, on the outskirts of Barcelona. The flames devoured everything in their path, but what lay inside the trunk was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. When they opened the trunk, they made a horrifying discovery: a body completely burned beyond recognition. No identity, no clear clues, just ashes and bones warped by the fire. But who was the victim? And, more importantly, who could have committed such a gruesome crime? What seemed like an unsolvable crime quickly turned into one of the most controversial cases in modern Spain. A tangled web of love, jealousy, and deceit. And at the center of it all, a woman named Rosa Peral. But the question that haunted everyone was this: was Rosa a victim caught in a cruel game, or the mastermind behind a cold-blooded murder? If you're fascinated by cold cases, secret files, unsolved disappearances, and supernatural phenomena, you've just found your new favorite channel. Subscribe now, turn on notifications to never miss a new video, and share with others. Don't forget to hit the like button. It helps us create even better content every day. To understand the crime, we must first understand the people involved. And to do that, we have to go back to a time before the flames, before the headlines, before the lies unraveled. At first glance, Rosa Peral seemed to have it all: a successful career, 2 daughters, and a charming presence that made her well-liked among her colleagues. She had spent years working in law enforcement, proving herself in a male-dominated field. But beneath the polished exterior, something much darker lurked. Pedr0 Rodr1guez, her boyfriend, was also a police officer. By all accounts, he was a kind and hard-working man, dedicated to his job and deeply in love with Rosa. To those around them, their relationship appeared stable, even happy. But what no one knew was that behind closed doors, tensions were brewing. Rosa had a past filled with complicated relationships. Before Pedr0, she had been involved with several men, including another police officer, R0sa Per. Albert was charismatic, confident, and shared a deep connection with Rosa. Their relationship had been passionate but volatile, and when it ended, it left lingering emotions that never fully faded. There are cases that shake a nation, that linger in the collective memory long after the courtroom doors have closed. The murder of Pedr0 Rodr1guez was one of them. It wasn't just a crime, it was a tragedy fueled by obsession, betrayal, and a love so toxic that it left only destruction in its wake. On the night of May 1st, 2017, Pedr0 was seen alive for the last time. He had spent the evening with Rosa at her home. What happened next remains a mystery, but investigators believe that Pedr0 was either drugged or attacked in his sleep. At some point during the night, he was killed, and then the cover-up began. In the early hours of May 6th, Rosa and Albert loaded Pedr0's body into the trunk of his car. They drove to a remote area near Foix, an isolated location where few people passed by at night. There, they set the car on fire, ensuring that all traces of evidence would be erased. The flames consumed everything. The next morning, Rosa continued with her life, as if nothing had happened. She sent messages to Pedr0's phone, pretending to be worried about his whereabouts. She even spoke to his colleagues, acting confused and concerned. But when Pedr0's car was discovered, burned beyond recognition, the perfect crime began to unravel. At first, investigators considered the possibility of an accident or even a robbery gone wrong. But as they dug deeper, inconsistencies in Rosa's statements began to surface. Her timeline of events didn't add up. Her behavior seemed rehearsed, calculated. And then, there was Albert. His involvement became undeniable when phone records and security footage placed him near the crime scene. When confronted, Rosa maintained her innocence. She shifted blame, suggesting that Albert had acted alone. Albert, in turn, accused Rosa of masterminding everything. Their once passionate connection turned into a battle of self-preservation. each trying to escape the consequences of their actions. But the evidence spoke louder than their words. The lies, the betrayal, the cold execution of a man who had trusted the wrong person. It was all there, in the details they couldn't erase. And soon the truth would be exposed. The case was far from over. The real question was, who was the true mastermind? Rosa, the woman who played the role of victim so convincingly, or Albert, the man who had been entangled in her web for years? Pedr0 Rodr1guez had always been a man of routine. He worked long hours as a police officer, dedicated to his job and the people around him. His relationship with Rosa Peral seemed like the next chapter of a stable life, until the cracks began to show. The kind of cracks that, at first, are small enough to ignore, but eventually become impossible to look past. As the days led up to his death, Pedr0 must have sensed that something was wrong. Rosa was distracted, distant. Some days, she was affectionate, pulling him back in with a smile and a soft touch. Other times, she was cold, detached. He couldn't understand why. But what he didn't know was that, behind his back, Rosa had been rekindling her relationship with Alb3rt L0pez, the man she had once loved, the man who was never truly gone from her life. Albert was different from Pedr0. Where Pedr0 was calm and responsible, Albert was impulsive, intense. He had a way of making Rosa feel alive, even when it came at the cost of others. Their relationship had always been complicated, but when she chose Pedr0 over him, Albert didn't take it well. He moved on, or at least, that's what everyone thought. But the truth was, he had never let go of Rosa, and Rosa had never really let go of him. In the weeks before Pedr0's murder, something changed. Messages between Rosa and Albert became more frequent. Secret meetings turned into plans whispered between them. The details of those conversations remain a mystery, but one thing was clear. Pedr0 was no longer part of the future they envisioned. On the evening of May 1st, 2017, Pedr0 went to Rosa's home as he had done countless times before. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that he knew what was coming. Investigators believe that at some point during the night, Rosa drugged him. It was a theory supported by the lack of defensive wounds on his body. If Pedr0 had been awake, he would have fought back, but there was no fight, no struggle, only silence. How exactly he died remains unclear. The forensic examination was inconclusive due to the extensive burns on his body. But one thing was certain. He never left Rosa's house alive. What happened next was methodical, calculated. Rosa and Albert waited until the dead of night before moving Pedr0's body. They wrapped him in sheets, carefully, almost delicately, as if that would somehow lessen the horror of what they were doing. They carried him to his own car, placing him in the trunk, and then they drove. The journey to Foix was long, silent. The kind of silence that fills the air when something irreversible has been done. When there's no turning back. The roads were dark, deserted. No one saw them. No one heard them. When they arrived at the isolated location, they doused the car in gasoline. A final act of destruction. Fire would erase everything. DNA, evidence, traces of guilt. As the flames consumed the vehicle, Rosa and Albert stood there, watching. They had won, or at least, they thought they had. The next morning, Rosa played her role perfectly. She sent messages to Pedr0's phone, pretending to be worried when he didn't answer. She texted his friends, asking if they had seen him. She even spoke to his colleagues at the police station, her voice filled with concern. It was a performance worthy of an award, but the fire hadn't done what they expected. Investigators arrived at the scene and quickly realized that this was no ordinary accident. The body in the trunk, though burned beyond recognition, showed signs of foul play. And soon, suspicions began to rise. Rosa continued to act innocent. When questioned, she suggested that Pedr0 had enemies, that perhaps someone had been after him. She spun stories, trying to lead the police away from the truth. But lies, no matter how well crafted, always start to unravel. Albert was the first to crack. Under pressure, his version of events started to shift. And when investigators discovered phone records placing him near the crime scene, there was no turning back. He was involved. And if he was involved, so was Rosa. The moment they were both arrested, their alliance shattered. Rosa pointed the finger at Albert, claiming he had acted alone, that she was just a victim caught in his obsession. Albert, on the other hand, told a different story. He said Rosa had planned it all, that she had manipulated him, using love as a weapon. In the end, the evidence spoke louder than either of them. The trial was one of the most sensational in Spain's recent history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, every detail scrutinized by the public. Rosa, once seen as an ambitious woman with a bright future, was now painted as a cold and calculating killer. Albert, the man who once adored her, was nothing more than an accomplice. The jury didn't take long to reach a verdict. Rosa Peral was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the murder of Pedr0 Rodr1guez. R0sa received 20 years. Justice, in the eyes of many, had been served. But the debate didn't end there. Some believed Rosa had masterminded the crime, using Albert as a pawn. Others argued that Albert was the true killer, and Rosa was simply caught in the storm. One thing, however, was undeniable. Pedr0 Rodr1guez had trusted the wrong person. He had loved someone who, in the end, saw him as disposable, and for that mistake, he paid the ultimate price. Rosa Peral and R0sa were now behind bars, but the case was far from over in the public's mind. The trial may have ended, but the debate over who was truly responsible for Pedr0 Rodr1guez's murder continued to spark controversy. Was Rosa the manipulative mastermind who orchestrated everything? Or was Albert the true killer, with Rosa merely playing along out of fear or misguided love? The courtroom had been a battlefield of conflicting testimonies, accusations, and attempts at self-preservation. Rosa had portrayed herself as a victim. She claimed that Albert had pressured her, that she had been manipulated, that she had feared for her life. She painted a picture of a toxic man who had control over her, making it seem as though she had no choice but to comply. Albert, on the other hand, had a different version. According to him, Rosa had been the one to lure him into the crime. He claimed she had spent weeks planting the idea in his mind, making him believe that Pedr0 was a threat to her happiness. He said that she had planned everything down to the last detail, convincing him that this was the only way they could be together. The prosecution, however, wasn't swayed by either of their shifting stories. The evidence against them was damning. Forensic specialists had managed to recover crucial data from Rosa's phone, revealing that she had continued texting Pedro's phone after he was already dead, trying to make it seem as though she was worried about him. Her alibi had been shaky from the start, and as investigators pieced together the inconsistencies in her timeline, the illusion of innocence fell apart. Albert's involvement was undeniable as well. Cell phone records placed him near the crime scene, contradicting his initial claim that he hadn't been there. And then there was the chilling discovery of his internet search history, queries about how to eliminate DNA evidence, how long it took for a body to burn, and details on arson techniques. Still, there was something deeper at play. The case wasn't just about murder. It was about manipulation, control, and deception. The trial had exposed the complex and toxic relationship between Rosa and Albert. It was clear that their bond had been filled with intense passion, but also deep-seated resentment. One moment, they were lovers willing to commit murder for each other. The next, they were enemies, tearing each other apart in court, desperate to shift the blame. During the trial, private messages between them were revealed, messages exchanged in the weeks before Pedro's murder. In them, Rosa and Albert spoke in cryptic terms, discussing solving the problem and getting rid of obstacles. To the prosecution, these messages were a blueprint for murder. To the defense, they were just vague exchanges with no concrete meaning. But the jury saw them for what they were: premeditation. The moment the guilty verdict was read, Rosa showed no visible reaction. She sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Albert, on the other hand, closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the weight of his fate. Their love story, if it had ever been love, had ended in the worst way possible. Yet, Even after their sentencing, Rosa refused to take full responsibility. She continued to insist that Albert had been the real killer, that she had been trapped in a situation she couldn't escape from. In interviews given from prison, she maintained that she had never planned Pedro's death. She claimed she had been manipulated, coerced. She even suggested that the media had turned her into a villain, twisting the narrative against her. But the facts remained. Pedr0 Rodr1guez was dead. His body had been burned in the trunk of his own car, and the two people responsible for that crime had been caught in a web of lies they could no longer escape. In the years following the case, public interest in Rosa Peral has never faded. Documentaries, crime shows, and even a Netflix series have explored the case in detail, dissecting every aspect of the investigation and trial. Some continue to argue about her level of guilt. Was she truly a cold-blooded killer, or was she merely an accomplice to Albert's deadly obsession? But for Pedro's family, there is no doubt. They lost a son, a brother, a friend, a man who had trusted the wrong person, a man who had fallen in love with someone who, in the end, saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. And so, the case of Rosa Peral remains not just a story of murder, but a chilling reminder of how far people will go when love turns into something far more dangerous. Even now, years later, the story of Rosa Peral and R0sa Per continues to haunt those who followed the case. What was the true nature of their relationship? Was Rosa a cunning manipulator, orchestrating the murder of a man who loved her? Or was she merely a woman trapped in the hands of a dangerous man, too afraid to say no? Was Albert the true mastermind? Or had he been blinded by passion, willing to do anything for the woman he still desired? The trial tried to answer these questions, but even with a guilty verdict, the truth remained tangled in a web of contradictions. Rosa and Albert, once partners in crime, turned on each other the moment they were caught. Their love, if it had ever been love at all, dissolved in the face of self-preservation. Rosa insisted that Albert had killed Pedro in a jealous rage. She described herself as a victim, manipulated and pressured into helping dispose of the body. But Albert painted a very different picture, one in which Rosa had been the one to set the plan in motion, leading him down a path from which there was no return. The jury listened to both sides, examined the evidence, and made their decision. Rosa Peral was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the murder of Pedr0 Rodr1guez. Alb3rt L0pez received 20 years. Their sentences reflected not only their crimes, but the way in which their betrayal had unfolded. One had led, the other had followed, but both were guilty. Still, even with a verdict, the debate continued outside the courtroom. Rosa became an object of public fascination. The media dissected her every move, from her behavior during the trial to the interviews she gave from prison. Some saw her as a cold-blooded killer, a woman who used her beauty and charm to manipulate those around her. Others saw her as a victim of a brutal and obsessive relationship with Albert, trapped in a cycle she couldn't escape. But the one voice that was lost in all of this was Pedro's, the man at the center of it all. A man who had no idea that the person he loved was plotting against him. A man who had trusted Rosa, who had ignored the warning signs, believing that love was enough to keep them together. His only mistake was placing his faith in the wrong person, and for that, he paid the ultimate price. His family never wavered in their belief that justice had been served. For them, there was no question of who was responsible. They lost a son, a brother, a friend, a man who had spent his life protecting others, only to be betrayed by someone he thought would protect him in return. As the years passed, Rosa Peral's story continued to draw attention. Documentaries, crime series, and even a Netflix production turned her case into a cautionary tale, one that blurred the lines between reality and entertainment. Was she a calculating killer or a woman caught in the middle of something she couldn't control? Did she manipulate Albert, or was she just as much a victim as Pedro? These questions may never have definitive answers, but one thing is clear: this was never a simple crime. It was a deadly game of power, manipulation, and deceit, a love triangle that ended in fire and ashes. And so, the question remains, was this a crime of passion, A premeditated execution? Or something even more sinister? An elaborate manipulation that played out like a deadly game? What do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy deep dives into the most chilling real-life mysteries, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.